Hewitt, MSNBC political analyst and host of the Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network, and John MSNBC political analyst, columnist at the Daily Beast. Well, Hugh, let me start with you. Over the weekend, I think anybody watching the news saw these scenes. There were obviously protests at the airport. There were stories here about interpreters, about people who'd helped the U.S. Armed Forces over in Iraq, over in the Middle East, being denied entry into the country, people with green cards being denied entry. They just happened to be out of the country while this happened. The Trump administration, talk, if you would, about their planning, their preparation for this, and what do you think that says about this administration?
Well, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus said yesterday, Steve, that it was an 80% policy, meaning 8 out of 10 Americans would agree with it. It could have been higher had they made the correction on green cards that now Secretary Kelly made this morning, and had they kept Iraq off the list. I really do think Iraq's got to come off of that list for a variety of reasons, including the fact that Iraqi pilots are training in Arizona, as Senator McCain pointed out. And I would also point out that when President Obama did this in 2011, there wasn't this hue and cry when he did a 6-month stand down on Iraqi refugees and Iraqi immigration. So a lot of this criticism is politically driven, but I hope that they get better at rollout, because if they had spent 6 hours before signing the executive order like they did 24 hours after signing it, we would have had a lot less hue and cry and a lot less manipulation of the story by, Trump hostels, people who want to paint Donald Trump as an extremist. In fact, he's keeping his campaign commitment, and I do think Priebus is right. It's about an 80% policy properly understood and laid out.
Well, Jonathan, let me ask you. He was making an argument there, I think, similar to what Sean Spicer was saying. Sean Spicer, we played the clip there. He said there needs to be a sense of proportion here when you consider sort of what the critics are saying versus what's actually happening. Do you think he has a point there?
Well, first of all, for proportion, you have to start with truth. And there's very little truth coming either out of Donald Trump or out of Sean Spicer. For instance, he said only 109 people were affected by this. That's not true. 109 people were detained at American airports, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, who were pulled off flights over the weekend. And my wife, getting on board a United Airlines flight in Mumbai, India, yesterday morning, witnessed firsthand 2 people being pulled out of the line and prevented from boarding that aircraft. So we don't know the full details of this. It has to be described as pathetically incompetent rollout of this new policy. So before we can assess it, we first have to understand what exactly happened.
So here's and we've already had the issue. Obviously, people with green cards, people who are permanent residents of this country, they happen to be out of the country. It gets announced suddenly they can't get back in. The administration says they are now dealing with that. The administration also says they are now drawing up a list of people who would be exceptions to this pause in immigration from these 7 Muslim majority countries. So if we put those 2 issues aside for a moment, and we talk about basically there is a temporary freeze now on all refugees. There's an indefinite freeze on refugees coming out of Syria, and there's this pause on immigration from these 7 Muslim majority nations. The administration says these are sort of hotbeds of jihadi activity. That's why they're on the list. They say they want to make sure they're getting information from the leaders of these countries about who these folks are who might be coming in. So that's what's on the table when you put those other 2 aside. Is Spicer right when he says there needs to be a sense of proportion versus what that is compared to what the critics are saying it is?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of overheated critics, but let's just break down what you just described for a moment. An indefinite ban on Syrian Muslim refugees. So think about that. What we're basically saying is that when Emma Lazarus, the Statue of Liberty, says, "Give me your tired, your poor, yearning to breathe free," the lamp of liberty has an asterisk next to it, unless you're a Syrian Muslim. Now, who are these Syrian refugees? These are people fleeing war. They are all thoroughly vetted. There was a piece on 60 Minutes last night about just how thoroughly they are being vetted. The idea that until Donald Trump became president, nobody checked these people is preposterous. We have not been attacked in the last 8 years by anybody getting over the border because procedures have been so tightened. So to now come along and say, We are not going to let anybody in. We were previously letting 10,000 Syrian refugees in. That was pathetic compared to the Europeans and their generosity. There's no evidence that terrorists are slipping in among those people fleeing war. It's inhumane, not compassionate, and not consistent with American values.
Let me ask you this question from a different angle, Hugh, because the administration, you have Sean Spicer at the briefing today, is basically saying, hey, everybody's got to calm down here. He says this is the rhetoric is out of proportion. But I want to play for you how this issue was introduced in the very first place by Donald Trump when he called for a ban on all Muslims entering the country during the campaign. This is what he said.
Donald J. Trump is calling for, now listen, you got to listen to this one because this is pretty heavy stuff, and it's common sense, and we have to do it. Remember the poll numbers, 25%, 51%. Remember the poll numbers. Okay, so remember this. So listen. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
So, Hugh, when you look at this, whatever you think of it, this is not the order he put in place, a worldwide ban on all Muslims entering the United States. So it's not what he described on the campaign trail. But I have to say, that campaign promise, he never renounced. He never said, I've changed my mind. He never said, forget it, it's off the table now. And when I look at these protesters over the weekend, I'm thinking, boy, if they are reading too much into this than is actually there, he's given them reason to, hasn't he?
No, not really, Steve, because over the course of the campaign, it was also made abundantly clear he was not going to install a Muslim ban, just like it was made abundantly clear he would not be revoking DACA, and he did not revoke DACA in his first 10 days in office. In fact, I think he's moving towards a comprehensive immigration overhaul. It's not a Muslim ban. As to the refugees, my friend Jonathan needs to remind people that the average number of total refugees in the United States for every year from 2002 to 2015 was, wait for it, 50,000. That's exactly what the executive order calls for. President Obama spiked it last year. He also needs to remind people that at the height of the Syrian genocide occurring on President Obama's watch, in 2012, I believe, less than 30 Syrians were allowed into the country. In 2011, less than 30 Syrians were allowed into the country. President Obama felt bad about the genocide that happened following the erasure of the Red Line, and he opened up the door a little bit more in 2016. Better that he had enforced the Red Line. I think that in the overall total context of this, although bad rollout, and I'm not going to spare them any criticism for failing to brief and failing to alert, that Wright's Priebus is right. It's an 80% policy. As to these 7 countries minus Iraq, I think we've got to get Iraq off of that list. There are too many exceptions, even if now Secretary Mattis makes a big, long list of all the Iraqis who have fought alongside our men and women and bled with them and helped them and saved them in many instances. So, constructed, hastily written, perhaps. We need the Senate to hurry up and confirm Rex Tillerson and Jeff Sessions so we can get some additional office holders in place. And the obstruction by Democrats in the Senate is part of this problem, and we should make sure to underscore that as well, Steve.
All right. Well, we will see. We do not have any poll numbers yet right now on how this went over. And obviously, we'll see how those stories, those scenes over the weekend affect how people think about this as well. I think it's an important part of the story. Hugh Hewitt, Jonathan Alter, thank you.